You are the key differentiator for your business, but how can you share about yourself in a way that converts your audience into clients? Well, our guest today is here to teach us how to craft stories in ways that grow your bottom line. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Content Creators Unite, the show where we discuss all things content creation. So if you want to learn how to grow your business using your blog, newsletters, books, and more, you're in the right place. I'm your host, John Clements, and our guest for today's episode is Danny Brassell, a highly sought after speaker, trainer, and coach known as Jim Carrey with a PhD. Dr. Brassell has spoken to over 3,500 audiences worldwide and authored 18 books, including his latest, Misfits and Crackpots. He helps entrepreneurs, executives, and business owners boost their income, freedom, and impact by improving their communication skills. He's the co-founder of the world's top reading engagement program, and he's on a mission to bring joy back into education and the workplace. So, Danny, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, John. And more importantly, thanks for spreading some joy in the world. You're doing a great job for all those content creators out there.
You bet. Thank you so much. So before we can dig into the technical questions, I really want to get to know you just a little bit better. So can you just share with me and with the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how it is that you got to do what you do?
Oh, gosh. Well, I guess a bunch of missteps is how I got to do what I do. I was a journalist many years ago. I got to cover President Bush Sr. for the 92 presidential election and had a great job. Got to work with every major newspaper editor on the planet. And one editor offered me a job at a major daily doing the city beat for $16,500 a year. And then a friend told me they were hiring teachers in inner city Los Angeles for $25,000 a year. So I always tell people I became an educator for the noblest of reasons, for the high pay. And I worked in the inner city for many years. Then I became a professor. And then in 2005, my wife and I attended a real estate seminar, which turned out to be a scam, and we lost everything. And I could focus on all the negatives, but I like to focus on the positives. First of all, I put her through the ringer. My wife's my soulmate. She's great. Second of all, I now know that money's not the end all be all, because you can lose it in a second, just like that. Third, I try not to judge other people, because if I was somebody who had looked at what I had done, I would have said, well, you deserve that. But now I realize if you don't know everything about a person, you really don't know anything about a person. Fourth, I became a Christian, which I'm always embarrassed to say, but the more I read the Bible, I'm not the first screw up to find Jesus. And fifth, I really didn't want to file bankruptcy. Eventually I had to because of North Cuba, also known as Florida. But my accountant said I had to make this much more money this year. And so I started speaking on the side, and I hit the number he gave me. Well, the next year, John, he gave me a much higher number, and I hit that number right on the number. Well, in year three, I thought, well, maybe I should set a higher number. And basically, during one of the worst economic downturns in American history, I was able to build up a really very profitable speaking business, which then the next pivot came when we had COVID occur, and I lost hundreds of speaking engagements within 24 hours. And for years, people had wanted me to coach them. And I always resisted, John, because I'm a teacher at heart, and I have a very high standard for my students. I really want them to succeed, and I actually won't let them not succeed. And it really bothers me when I don't see people do the work. And so I started coaching people, and I found my tribe. I love working with entrepreneurs and business people that are motivated, that want to do the work. And it's been a real blessing. So that's a very long answer to your short question, but I guess missteps and lots of pivots. That's the story of my life.
Yeah, I kind of thought you were joking, and then it turns out you were not joking. But that's pretty cool that you're able to look back on it, because those are hard things to go through, and through the lens of faith to say, okay, well, yes, those are hard, but God intended them for good. I love that. Love that story.
Thank you.
So what is it that is exciting? So you're helping entrepreneurs succeed. You're helping business people succeed. Like, what excites you about that? You said like those are your people. Like, Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, so I've worked with speaking coaches. I know a lot of great speaking coaches, and I'll send you to a lot of these people. There's a big difference between what I do and what a lot of these people do. Is a lot of the people I've worked with, they want you to talk about the saddest moments in your life, and There's three reasons why I don't want you to do that. First of all, the world just survived a global pandemic. Everybody's had bad stuff happen to them. I think we need more hopeful stories. We don't need to hear another sob story. Second of all, what I train people to do, I call it a well-crafted story. Politicians, they call it a stump speech. This is a speech you give again and again to introduce yourself to new audiences. For like comic book movies, it'll be like the origin story. Simon Sinek in his book, Start With Why, he'd say this is your visionary statement. This is how you introduce yourself to new audiences. Well, do you really want to tell that same sad story again and again over 1,000 times? I really don't know how people do that. It's really depressing. And third, and this is where people get angry with me, I have one objective when I'm on stage. I want you to leave feeling better than when you came in. I want you laughing, smiling, happy. I think there's something noble about the objective to get you to feel better about yourself. I believe that these people that tell that same sad story again and again, by the 20th time they're telling that story, those are now crocodile tears, and now you're being manipulative. And I'm not saying it's not an effective sales technique. It's a very effective sales technique. But I, for one, don't want to have to take a shower after I speak every time because I'm just manipulating my audience. And so for example, I work with a lot of engineers in Silicon Valley. So a lot of these guys, they're introverted. So they're trying to figure out a way to make themselves more engaging to their audiences. So I was working with a gentleman, he's Indian engineer, and he said, Danny, can you make me more interesting? And he has a very difficult name to pronounce. And so all we did to make him a little bit more engaging is at the beginning of his presentation, he says his name, which is about 28 syllables. He's like, hello, my name is, and then he pauses now and he says, gee, I sure hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it gets people to smile and just giggle. You don't have to be a stand-up comedian, but I'm just trying to get people to laugh and stay with me throughout the presentation. I love watching people that think that they're introverted and they don't have personality. Everybody has personality. Here, I'll give a little ninja strategy for everybody in your audience listening right now. So later on, get a pen and paper, sit in a comfortable chair, get a libation of choice, and for an hour, I want you to write down every story that's ever happened in your life. I don't want you to write down the entire story, just the triggers, like the time I locked myself out of the car in front of Costco, the time Dad spilt mustard on his tie when we were at that fancy restaurant. You'll find in an hour, you'll easily come up with like 400 or 500 of these stories. So that's the first part of the exercise. The second part of the exercise is then I want you to think about, well, what's this really a story about? Oh, this is a story about never giving up. Oh, this is a story about being accountable. Oh, this is a story about love. And so if you actually look at my computer, I literally have tens of thousands of these stories on my computer. So whenever I'm giving a presentation and I want to make a point, I use one of these types of, here's a story I'll give. I used to be an elementary school principal. And so this was a start to one of my presentations. I say, when I was an elementary school teacher, every other teacher at my school went through hundreds, if not thousands of Band-Aids every single school year. I mean, kids, they want Band-Aids. They work better than smokes on the prison yard. Well, every year I went through exactly one Band-Aid, and my colleagues always asked, well, what's your secret? Well, on the first day of school, I always have a chubby little boy in my class. We'll call this boy Paco. He's picking at his scab all morning long, finally has success after lunch. The annoying girl next to him raises her hand, rubs her nose, and says, Mr. Brassell, Paco's bleeding. I'm like, oh my gosh, Paco, you know what you need? You need a Band-Aid. Now 33 little heads look at me, and I'm like, I have a drawer full of Band-Aids in my desk, and I don't have just ordinary Band-Aids. I have Mighty Morphin Power Ranger Band-Aids, and I'm going to give you the Green Ranger because he's the coolest. Now, Paco's smiling. Every little kid in the class is smiling. I take Paco to my desk. Oh, before I put on the Band-Aid, we got to clean out the wound. Then I show all the kids the clear bottle of rubbing alcohol. I say, hey, Paco, hold on to my hand. This might sting a little bit. I start pouring on the rubbing alcohol. He starts screaming bloody murder. I put on the Band-Aid and say, all right, anybody else need a Band-Aid? John, my students could have a skull fracture, and they will never ask me for a Band-Aid. Ladies and gentlemen, today, I'm not going to give you Band-Aids. I'm going to give you practical strategies on how to create an engaging presentation that gets your audience to take the next step. So you see what I just did there is I took a story that was completely unrelated, but I made sure that the point was the point that I wanted to land. Again, that's a very long answer to your short question, but I get very excited about this is why I get excited working with entrepreneurs, is figuring out, well, what's their background and what's their story and how do we make them a little bit more engaging to the world.
Yeah, no, that's great because it actually leads into first of all, wonderful story. Now, like, I want to know more about your presentation, but it leads into the next question, which is just like, yeah, you let's say that I'm working with you and I am just like the worst communicator on the planet, or at least I think so. Like, what are you going to tell that person the first time you meet them? How are you going to even get them to, like, what if I say, I can't think of a 400 stories? Like, what are you, nuts? Like, how do you, get over those humps?
Well, now every now and then you have somebody difficult like that. They don't want to get personal. So with the people that don't want to get personal, I say, well, look at personal development books. What's one of the most successful personal development books of all time? It's Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, in which he shares no personal stories. All of his stories are based on millionaires that he interviewed. So I say, if you really think you have nothing to share with the world, we'll find other interesting people and we'll create a presentation based on their stories. But getting to the main point of your question is, you have to understand that speaking is a skill, just like podcasting is a skill. I guarantee you that the first time you did this podcast, John, you stunk. And the second time you stunk, but you stunk a little bit less than the first time. And now you're like an old pro and you've gotten used to a whole flow. And it's just like anything. You used to work for Boeing. I mean, anything that you do in life, you got to do the reps. And so when I'm working with people, I say, it's a formula. I don't know how to bake chocolate chip cookies, but believe me, if you gave me a recipe on how to bake chocolate chip cookies and I followed the instructions, I guarantee you I could create a decent batch of chocolate chip cookies. Might not be the best, but I guarantee the second time I did it'd be even better, and the third time even better. And so I have a framework. I lead these monthly workshops with my co-founder, Coach Jimmy Hayes Nelson. I call us the professor and the poet. I have the education background. He used to be a Broadway actor. And so in our 2-day workshops, we basically lead people through what we call the 5 C's. And so those 5 C's are clarity, connect, content, call to action, and your close. And so before anything, this is going to be amazing to everybody in your audience. There are 2 questions you have to ask yourself. These are the clarity questions. You have to ask these 2 questions. If you can answer them, then you have a business. Now, if you can't answer them, you're going to struggle. And they're very basic questions, and you'd be amazed. 95% of the people I work with cannot answer these questions concisely. So the first question is, who is your audience? Now, a lot of people say, oh, my audience is everybody. I'm like, well, if your audience is everybody, your audience is nobody. You need to really niche it down. I worked with a woman a couple of weeks ago. She was phenomenal. Her niche is she makes the horses for professional polo players. I was like, oh my gosh, that's the greatest niche I've ever heard. And she makes like $800,000 a year making saddles for professional polo players. I've worked with morticians. Like, you wouldn't think about how much money you can make as a mortician. This guy's like making a bundle. So that's the audience, a very niche down audience. Like your podcast is dealing with entrepreneurs that are content creators. That's smart. You could even niche it down even more. Bearded white male from Seattle that creates content. I mean, I guarantee you there's lots of bearded white males in Seattle that are doing that. But I mean, and then you can expand from there. So the first question is, who is your audience? The second question is, what's the problem that you solve? You'd be amazed. Most people can't actually describe what's the problem that you solve. I'm like, well, if you can't describe the problem that you solve, or they'll come up with 28 different things. And I'm like, I love In-N-Out Burger. The thing I love about In-N-Out Burger is when you go there, it's real easy. I want a burger and fries. They don't overwhelm you with the Cheesecake Factory menu, which is like an encyclopedia, and there's 28 things, and I can't make a decision because there's too many choices. Who's your audience? What is the problem that you solve? That's where we start. And it's amazing, when you can actually describe these things. So people ask me, Danny, so what do? You teach people how to speak? I'm like, actually, what I do is I help individuals, entrepreneurs, and organizations leverage speaking on stages as a major client lead source that converts. That sounds different. Now they're like, well, wait a sec, you're telling me I can get clients? I'm like, yes. And the most effective tool to get more clients is through your speaking. So speaking is what I'm going to teach you, but what I'm going to help you, the problem I'm helping you solve is I want you to get more customers, whether, if I'm working with a nonprofit, like I'll work with ministers, I'm going to get more ties to your church. Or if it's a nonprofit, hey, more donations to your cause. If it's a politician, hey, I'm going to get more voters to support you. If it's an entrepreneur, I'm going to get more people to buy your product or to invest in your coaching program. That's what we're going to do. Again, long answer to your short question.
Yeah. No, so I like this idea of the 5 C's. And unfortunately, I was not taking notes, so I don't recall the other 4. But anyway, I'm guessing that those 5 C's not only are tips about effective communication, but I'm guessing there's hidden traps behind each of these 5 C's and not doing them. So what are some of the traps that you see people falling into? So lack of clarity is one. So what are some other traps that people fall into?
Yeah, so the most important thing is the very beginning of your talk is the connection part. So that's our second C is connection. So how are you connecting? And so your audience in the first, few minutes of your presentation, they're going to make the decision. Are they going to be present for your presentation, or are they going to be engaged? And you know that they're engaged when they're leaning forward, like you're talking to them. And one of this probably the best strategy I would share with people is a lot of people like to boast about all of their accomplishments. I'm like, do exactly the opposite. Talk about all your failures, because not everybody in your audience has succeeded, but they've all failed. And the more you talk about your own failures, you're going to really connect with your audience. I mean, Brene Brown, she's a wonderful speaker. In her book, Dare to Lead, she talks about vulnerability. You need to talk about your vulnerability. So for example, Jimmy and I were working a couple of months ago with a financial advisor named Richard. And Richard, at the beginning of his talk, he talks about how, he's worked in the financial industry for 30 years. He's made his clients over $1 billion. And he talked about all the famous people he'd worked with. I'm like, well, that's great. But Richard, what are the 3 most important aspects of real estate? Location, location, location. You do have to talk about this at one point in your presentation. We're going to put it further back in your presentation, but at the beginning of your talk, we need people to relate to you. And so now what he does is at the beginning of his presentation, he talks about the very first client he ever was able to obtain. And he talks about basically a comedy of errors of everything he did wrong to get this person. It's amazing the person even signed. And he said 2 weeks later, he was doing this, he does like these presentations every week at a steakhouse for like 15 couples so that they'll do their retirement planning with him. And he said he noticed it right away that people used to come in, he'd have like 15 couples, and the husband always has his arms crossed across his chest, like, what are you trying to sell me? And he says now at the beginning of his talk, everybody, they're patting their knees, they're laughing so hard. I'm like, that's where your connection is. So you got to get those people connected. And here, I'll give a ninja strategy to your audience right now, John. So I watch a lot of award shows, because when the person wins the Academy Award, they only have 45 seconds to connect with their audience. And most people, they waste their time. They get up there like, oh, I want to thank my agent, I want to thank God, I want to thank the Academy. It's stupid. Nobody pays attention. But every now and then a person really connects. So a few years ago, there was a guy by the name of Joe Walker. He won the Academy Award for Best Film Editing. Well, this is Hollywood, John. This is the important people. The actors are in the audience. You can see nobody's paying attention to Best Film Editor. And Joe Walker, he gets up there, and he's British, and he speaks very slowly. He says, a lot of people don't know this, but when phrased properly, the term Academy Award nominee can be used as an insult. Well, now the camera's panning the audience. You see everybody kind of leaning in like, what's he talking about? And he says, for example, yesterday I got in an argument with my 17-year-old daughter, and she said, well, Academy Award nominee Joe Walker. All of a sudden, you see everybody laughing. He gets off stage, John. Denzel Washington wants to meet him. Will Smith wants to meet him. Sandra Bullock wants to meet him. Time magazine said it was one of the highlights of the Academy Awards. That's the power of connection. When you can connect with your audience, now you've got them focused. I mean, I always like to, I'm kind of snarky about this, but I'm like, you ever notice that no presidential candidate ever grew up middle class? They always were born like, impoverished in a log cabin. You have to do that background story, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to connect with people. People can't connect with you if they think that, everything works out perfectly in my life, and I'm married to a supermodel. I have diamonds in my shoes. It's crazy. So the most important part of your presentation, after you find out the clarity of your presentation, what do I do and who do I serve? The next thing you have to do is, how do I connect with my audience within the first few minutes of my presentation?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned failure, because earlier you said, well, I don't want to like rehash all my sob stories. But to your point, like I actually just, in my personal life, I just preached a sermon at my own church, and I talked about how I failed at planting a church in early 2021, 2022. And let me tell you, I preach every now and again, but a lot of times you get people to come up to you afterwards and say, hey, good job. Thanks for, and it's just, okay, thanks. But this one, I'm here to tell you, to your point, when I started talking about my biggest failure on a public stage, I had so many people come up to me with like literally with tears in their eyes. Thank you. I'm going through this thing right now, and I feel like a complete jerk. And now I know I don't have to, right? Because I ended with hope, that your failures don't define you. In fact, God can even use your failures, as your own story illustrates. So I love that point of that connection point. I do think failure leading to hope or something better is such a great connection point that so many people don't use.
Yeah, I completely agree, John. And I love that you just shared that. I mean, because maybe your situation's different than everybody audience. Maybe you suffered a divorce, or maybe you suffered a financial mishap, or maybe you tried a church plan and it didn't work. But what that's going to do, it's going to connect to their audience, and they're going to say, for me, it was surviving cancer, or for me, it was, overcoming the death of a child or something. That's where you've really created by sharing your pain. But again, and I like the way you're doing it, you're ending with hope. Like, you can share pain, and don't get me wrong, I think it's important to share your pain, but you don't have to do it where like you can't hear a pin drop in the room because everybody's so uncomfortable because you're talking about something really, I mean, I've heard people talk about some uncomfortable things. And what I love to do is, this is why, people always ask me, how do you become a better speaker? One of the best ways is to watch lots of speakers. So I watch televangelists, I watch politicians, I watch comedians. I really love watching comedians because comedians demonstrate this point better than anybody else. So Kevin Hart is a short black guy, and so he makes a lot of jokes about being a short black guy. Jim Gaffigan's a big fat white guy, so he makes a lot of jokes about being a big fat white guy. What they're doing is they're taking their greatest weakness and they're turning it into their strength, because once you've accepted the fact that you are who you are, people can't rip you for that. You've just made yourself impermeable. It's fantastic strategy. That's what not to get political, President Reagan in the 1984 presidential debate, the second debate, his first debate, he couldn't remember anything. And so the very first question they asked him in the second debate is, you couldn't remember a lot, President Reagan, in that first debate. Is age an issue in this campaign? And his response was phenomenal. He said, I am not going to make age an issue in this campaign. I am for political gain. I am not going to point out to the American public my opponent's youth and inexperience. He got Mondale laughing. I'm like, oh my gosh, he won the election based on that comeback. I mean, he just totally turned it around. So that's why you watch other people. I'm always trying to figure out, well, how do they do it in a clever way? So I love that you shared that, John. That's great. That's a great testimony.
Yeah. And just to kind of reel it back into like a business sense, another thing, I don't know what you think, but what I think is, when I look on LinkedIn and I see the people who only post about how successful they are, it kind of makes me not want to read their stuff. I'll be honest, right? Because I know they're not successful. They know they're not successful. Like, just how about be real? How about that for a change?
That's right.
But at the same time, I also don't like the people who just get on there to complain. Like, so I think you have to have a balance.
Yeah. Well, there's a great quote, and I'll butcher the quote. I'm just going to paraphrase it. But Max Levchin. Do you know who Max Levchin is?
I don't think that I do.
Okay. So Max Levchin, you'll love this because it's one of my favorite quotes. It's like, my first business was a colossal failure. My second one wasn't much better. It still failed. My third one, I almost got it right. Number 4, we were right there. Number 5 was PayPal. I'm like, well, if it only takes you 4 failures to get to $1 billion company or not. But I love that. It's showing the struggle. Like, people need to see the struggle. You don't just Michael Jordan didn't become the world's greatest basketball player because he just had God's gift and, oh, I shall just bestow it upon everyone. He worked his butt off. People didn't see, Kobe Bryant has that great quote. He said, you work hard in the dark so you can shine in the light. People don't, and especially this audience, that we're talking to a lot of entrepreneurs that are sitting there and they're probably all alone on their computer 18 hours a day trying to succeed. Stick at it. That's how you do it. Like, you learn, you fail, you do it again. What Samuel Beckett, ever tried, ever failed, no worries, try again, fail better. That's exactly right. Keep at it.
So this has been great. And we're talking a lot about speaking, I think, in particular. So what I want to do, because really this show is designed to help people with written content. So you've also written 18 books. Yeah. So how do you take these, which is amazing, by the way, because I've written 0 books, but so how do you take these principles that are so valid in the speaking space and then translate them into the written space?
Well, so I was a writer. I told you that I was a writer before I was any of these things. I absolutely love writing, but now, with AI, anybody can write. You can create your own bot, so it'll actually write in your voice. I love that, but I can't remember who said the quote. It's on my desk. I can't remember the guy who said it, but he basically says, writing is easy. You just stare at a blank piece of paper until blood drops form on your forehead. And it's exactly right. Like, I hate writing. It's a pain. I love having written, but like when you're writing that book, it stinks. When I was doing my dissertation, my refrigerator was never cleaner, John, because every time I looked at that blank screen, I said, I need to rearrange some condiments. And finally, I just said, hey, I'm going to write a page a day. And in 365 days, I will have a 365-page dissertation. Same thing with a book. Is I'm like, hey, I'm going to allocate 1 hour a day, and I have to get 4 pages done, and I'll be able to do it that way. And so you just have to be very disciplined about it. It's just like everything. I mean, most people waste their time on their phones, on social media. I think when used properly, if telephone is a fantastic tool. I mean, I set reminders every single day. I mean, I'm a bad Christian. I'm trying to learn different scriptures. And so every day it's at 11:25, I go through Proverbs 11:25. Oh, gosh, I'm going to screw it up right now. With Proverbs 11:25, and I've screwed it up. Let me see. I'm trying to think of. I'm trying to impress you with at least one scripture I can actually remember. 7:14 in the morning. It's 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, then I will turn. I'm practicing. Okay. But that's what I'm doing. That's what I do, is like every single day. So like, I'll set the day, like, okay, for, at 9:11, this is my emergency time. For the next 20 minutes, I need to write for 20 minutes. I got married on December 20th. So every day at 12:20, I send my wife a text telling her I love her. I mean, like, allocate your I have a friend, he's a time management expert, and I give him a hard time. I'm like, there's no such thing as time management. There's only priority management. Harvard did a study, 100 years ago, there was only 24 hours in people's days back then. Also, it's how are you allocating your time? The entrepreneur, it says, I have no time to write. I'm like, yeah, I mean, you have no time to get more business. I mean, you need to learn how to start writing copy. And again, there's no excuse now with AI. There are so many different tools out there. And I mean, I use lots of different tools. I don't just use ChatGPT. I mean, it's great for certain things, but I find for writing, Claude is much better for writing at capturing my voice. Gemini is good at certain things. There's so many different AI tools. There's really no excuse anymore. And I've always told that to my teams. I'm like, the next time you want to give me an excuse, just say Peru has a new dictator. And people say, what? I'm like, say Peru has a new dictator. I'm like, Peru has a new dictator. They're like, what's that got to do with anything? I'm like, well, one excuse is as good as another. It didn't get done, did it?
I like that. I'm going to remember that with my kids next time.
Yes.
And just so you know, just to help you feel a little bit better, I went to seminary. I have a seminary degree. I have a master's in biblical studies. I am terrible at memorization. Absolutely terrible. So don't feel bad.
That I tried to impress you, but I'm sitting there. I'm like, because I have all these different, I have, but I can never remember the exact verse. I mean, I remember the verse. Like, so there's one, it's like, I think it's 1 Corinthians 5:30. 30, but it's like, do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Like I was like, oh, that's a good one. My men's Bible study, they're so good at this. I'm an amateur, but it's actually a good demonstration for your audience. All of us have to be constant students. You're constantly learning.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I need to be respectful of time, both yours and the audience's. So I do want to ask you a couple extra questions just about you, to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm going to assume you talked about priorities management. I'm going to assume you have good boundaries in your life as well. So when you're not working, what do you like to do?
Oh, I love to read. I'm a big reader. I read. I tell people I had read Edmund Morris's first biography on Teddy Roosevelt, The Rise of Teddy Roosevelt. It's part of a trilogy, and fantastic trilogy. But I got to admit, before I read that book, I knew only two things about Teddy Roosevelt. I knew that teddy bears were named after him, and for some reason, his face is on Mount Rushmore. I mean, you talk about a 6-year period in a person's life. When he was 36 years old, he was police commissioner of New York City. When he was 37, he was assistant secretary of the United States Navy. When he was 38, he led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. When he was 40, he was elected governor of New York, and he didn't even have an affair. When he was 42, he was elected vice president of the United States. Later that year, he became then, and to this day, following the assassination of President McKinley, the youngest president in American history. I mean, not a bad 6-year period. I mean, what stood out in that book to me, though, was when he was a kid, he was sick all the time. So he spent all of his time reading. So he was a speed reader. He had a photographic memory, and he could read in 6 languages. They say you could give him an 800-page book in Latin at dinner, and he'd quote pages to you at the breakfast table. They estimate by the time he was 30 years old, he had read over 20,000 books. So you have to say what my kindergartners say. They always go, wow. And so I'd always look at the kids. I'm like, all right, kids, we're going to start reading a lot of books. I mean, I read 10 books a day now. A lot of them are scratch and sniff and pop up, but I do read 10 books a day. So that's the thing for everybody out there. Most people are getting most of their media from visual places. But I mean, I'll read an entire book just looking for one anecdote, which is like, ooh, that's gold. I can use that. And so I would encourage everybody, especially if you're trying to become a better speaker, better writer, to get those stories. The last book I wrote, The Misfits and Crackpots, the last 2 books, Leadership Begins with Motivation. When I was a middle school teacher, none of my kids used to be tardy because I used to always start off class with a Paul Harvey story. You're not as old as me, John. When I was a kid, I used to listen to Paul Harvey every day.
Oh, I know who that is.
Yeah. He'd be like, I'm a Paul Harvey with the rest of the story. And for 5 minutes, you're trying to guess who's he talking about or what's the thing. But a lot of his stories are about like Sears and Roebuck. Well, kids today don't know what Sears and Roebuck is. And so when I wrote Leadership Begins with Motivation, it was stories about like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Well, after I wrote the book, it was fascinating. I read it, and completely unintentionally, most of my stories were of white male Americans. And so the latest book I wrote, Misfits and Crackpots, most of those stories are about females, minorities, and international people to get people excited. I call it, short, inspiring stories for busy people. So again, that's a very long answer to your short question, but I read.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So I do know who Paul Harvey is because when I went to the barber as a kid, that's what he listened to. So I know that. And then to your point, we actually share the same opinion about books. Whereas if I can get a single piece of information or a story or something that makes me a better person in some way, then as far as I'm concerned, that's the greatest book ever.
That's right.
So to that, can you share with us just a piece of wisdom or a life lesson that you've learned in your journey? It could be life related, it could be work related, something that you could leave our audience with so they could just become better people.
So I'd say life's too short. That's what I tell my kids all the time. And so I do pre-week planning. 2 of my favorite coaches I ever had were Rob and Steve Schallenberger, and they talk about becoming your best. And what I love is they talk about spokes in a wheel. And so you can do the exercise with it, whatever spokes you want. I used to be a teacher, so everything has to be like the same letters and stuff. So I have faith goals, family goals, financial goals, fitness goals, fulfillment goals, focus goals, and fun goals. And so the exercise is on each spoke of the wheel. You give yourself a score of 1 to 10. Where do you? 10's the best and 1's the lowest. And so where are you physically right now, fitness wise? I'm about a 7. Okay. Well, about financial? I want to be making more. I'm at a 3. It really doesn't matter what your answers are, because after you make the dots on all the spokes of the wheel. Then you have to connect the dots. And if that's not a perfect circle, you're not in alignment. And that's what's important. And so that would be my advice to everybody out there. Is a lot of us, especially in your audience, they're really focused on the business, but the business isn't going to help you if you're 50 pounds overweight and you're smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee all the time, and you're ignoring your family, and you haven't read a Bible or attended church service in a year, or think about, and fun's just as important as well. Sometimes you have to go out and take I call them thought walks every day, where it's just me listening to a podcast. I listen to your podcast because it's positive, so I'll just walk around the neighborhood for a half an hour, listen to the podcast, and striving for as much balance as possible.
Yeah, and I love that analogy because I love you said the words balance and alignment, and you didn't say the words perfect or better.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that. So last question, Danny, it's been a pleasure. Where can people go if they want to learn even more about you?
Well, I wanted to give everybody a freebie since they had to endure me and you had to endure me for this time. So if you go to freestoryguide.com, again, freestoryguide.com, we'll take you through the 5 C's and help you craft your well-crafted story presentation. And again, I just really want to thank you for all that you're doing, John. You're inspiring people. You inspire me, and keep on doing it. The world needs you.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, again, Danny, it's just been a pleasure. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed our discussion today as much as I did, which I'm sure you did, be sure to subscribe because you don't want to miss out on future episodes. I bring on the best people I can find. I let them shine, and then you get the value. So be sure to subscribe, like, comment, do all of the things. And with that, I want you to have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the Content Creators Unite podcast.